Yeah, ready to go. Okay, so we are at the bottom of Chav Beis on the base, and the Gemara was discussing the fact that goyim are might be more interested in their behemoths than women because of the zuhama that was injected into them by the nachash, by the chet of Chava. The Gemara asked, "We're also descendants of Chava. What happened to our zuhamasam?" So the Gemara tells us by Har Sinai it was Pascha zuhamasam. Problem is the Gemara also brings down that by the Egel we got our Zuhama back. So I guess it's not so poshut how the Zuhama works, and I guess somehow we didn't get that back. Now Tosfos points out also a very important thing. Tosfos says, "Oiv the Chav Shalom the Sinai, Venira the Gerim Nami." The Pascha. What about Gerim? They were not there they were not by our Sinai. Gerim, they came later. Where did they get rid of their Zuhama from? Hainu mishum de afal gav the inu loy hava mazlayu havu. Even though the goyim themselves were not by Ma'amid our Sinai, their mazel was. I don't know exactly what this specifically means. This is a Gemara in Shabbos, but some part of these future Gerim, some part of them were there, and that part was able to get rid of the Zuhama. Let's think a second. But Goyim never got rid of the Zuhama. Second. Okay, gewaltig. Bezog to Gemara. We said that sending your animals to a goy to watch is not allowed. Why? Because they're choshed to be reveya them. What about birds? Are they also choshed to be reveya birds? I'm not even exactly sure how one would do that, but is that also is that mutter? Is that also? Zok Gemara Toshma. The Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel Mishum Rab Chanina. Anira isi oivet kechavim. I saw a guy. Shalokach avos minashuk. He bought a goose. Rava, he was boiled the goose. Chanka, he then killed it. Sala, he roasted it for achla. He was a multi-purpose device. It was available for sale at a grocery store and at an adult store. I guess they had special stores that were adult grocery stores. I saw an Arab. Now, if we're trying to bring a raya to Oifos, it must have been the yerech of a bird, a pulket, and he cut a hole in it to create himself a hole to do his perversions. Rava, then he was revered the bird. Salah, he roasted it, the achla, and then he ate it. So you see that, in fact, they are chosher to be revered birds, so you would not be allowed to have them watch your birds. Okay, now let's go on to today's Amid on Chol Gimel Amid Aleph. Ravina Omar, Loy Kasha. We had a kasha that started this whole sugya, and that is that our Mishnah says you're not allowed to leave one of your animals by a goy because you'll be machshalim with reveya. But the Mishnah also says that you're allowed to buy an animal from a goy for a korban. How could you possibly buy an animal from a goy for a korban if we're choshit that the goy was reveya? So we had already terutzim that a goy wouldn't be reveya his own animal. But Ravina wants to say a different shot. You're not allowed to give an animal to a goy to watch because he might be reveya. But that doesn't mean that you assume the vadoyis that he was reveya an animal. Therefore, you could buy an animal from him and use it for a korban. Zok to Gemara uminot taimra the shiny bein lechatchila bein l'di'evet. How do you know that you could make that distinction? That you could be choshed that it'll be reveya, but not asher the animal if it's possible he was Reveya. It's non we learned, Loit is Yachid Isha Imahem. A woman may not be Misyachid with a goy, Mipnei Shechashudin al Harayas, because they're Chashud on the Harayas. Or Mini. Break the Gemara Akasha. Hoisha Shenech B'Shah, Bidei Avdikachov. A woman who was captured by goy. Al Yidei Mamain, if the reason why they captured her is because she owed them money and they were holding her to extort what they wanted from her, then Mutaris Labaila, and we will assume that they were not boiler, they didn't violate her. Al Yidei Nefashos, but if she's Chayiv Misa and then they got her and she escaped, we have to assume that she was violated. And therefore she's a Surah Labaila. Ella Lav Shmamina. So here you see that by Mammon, she's not Mutaris Labaila. She is Mutaris Labaila, yet it says like this Yachid Isha Imayim Pnei Shechashudin al Haroyes. So you see, you could be Choshid them for Haroyes, and therefore you shouldn't be Miyachid with them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if a Yichud happened, that we automatically assume the worst. Lav Shmamina, Shani Lon Ben Lechatchila L'Diyevet. Sure, Lechatchila, a woman shouldn't be Miyachid with a Goy, because he's Choshid as Nus. But B'Diyevet, if she was, Lav Dafka, will she become Asura L'Vaila. Zok to Gemara, Zok Mimai, you don't have a right from here at all. Maybe once we're choshed that a guy will be mizana with a woman, automatically, if a woman is locked up with a guy, she is choshed, and she would be also. The only reason why the Brisa says if it's Alidei Mama and Muteris Labaila is the Misyari Mishum Hefsed B'Mainai. You know why the guy's not going to bail her? Because if he's boiler, he's afraid no one will bail her out anymore, and he'll never get his money back. So that's why he's not boiler. But normally, he would be boiler. And Teda, bring your right. The Katani Seifa, Alidei Nefashos is Asur Labaila. Vesu Loi Midi. End of the conversation. You don't have a raya from here that there's a difference between the Chatchil and B'Diavad. Ravina might have a good teretz, but from this, Isha Shenech B'Shah, you don't have a raya. Now this poses many problems. Because what would be the problem if an Isha was Nensa? An Isha Yisrael that was Nensa is mutter to her husband. So what's the whole problem over here? So Tosha speaks out, Pirsha Kodris, the Mayri Be'eshes Yisrael. But the problem is if it's Eshes Yisrael, the kosher, Imkain, Hey Chimuchach the Shari B'Diavad. How do you have a right from your Shari B'Diavad? Mishim Damrina Devadla Nivala, who said? Maybe this woman was Nevelas. You know why she's Mutter L'Baila? If she was violated, she's not also to her husband. She might be also to her husband if her husband's a Kohen. But if her husband's Israel, she's not also to him. Different Muteris. Ve'en la'Isra, Zok Toisus, we not mistaber to Aser, Mishum Deshema Nisratzis Loi. Because maybe she willingly was Nevelas to this guy who captured her. The Vadai Kivan the Einin it Peses and the Foshois Loi Mifchada V'Loi Misratzis Loi. If she's not there to be killed, she's not afraid that she's going to get killed. And therefore, she would never do this willingly. So the problem is, at the end of the day, how could you say it's speaking about an Eshes Yisrael, and Eshes Yisrael would be Mutter L'Baila? We're talking about an Eshes Koyin, the Af Ba'onis Asura. Even if she was violated, she's still going to be awesome. The Hacha Muteris. And here, you know why it's Mutter? Why? Because they don't want to lose the money that they're going to get ransom for her. So Frekta is the Kasha. Frekta is a very big Kasha. Kasha. Tema here, the Sulai Midi. Pirish the Vadai Hefsid Mom and Shiny. Ava Yichud Ba'alma, Ema Dosha B'Diavad. So what does the Gemara want to say? You don't have a raya that Halach Chila B'Diavad. Maybe if she was Messiachin with a goy, she would be Osir. Only if it's Machmas Mammon do we say she's Mutter. Because they don't want to violate her because they want to get their money out of her. Correct Tosh is always a Tema. Imkein lohi nachda bas lavram avinu eishes koini sheves tachas baila. If you're going to say we automatically assume that she was violated when she was musachad with a goy, so then you have a major problem, because how could an eishes koin be mutter to her husband? Every person, it's impossible that they didn't come into a situation where they were mishachet with a guy. It happens a lot. Sure, you're not allowed to be miyachet, but it happens sometimes, and it can happen often that sometimes a woman's miyachet with a guy. So if that's the case, if you hold that if a woman's miyachet with a guy, we assume that she was violated, so then every issue's going should be also to her husband. Not practical to say that a woman will never be miyachet with a guy, and if that's the case, if she's a bas kohen, according to what we're saying, if she's an eishes kohen, she's also a baila. The chivin lech gavs and man chashinon. The shleimer zok toisves the ein zel adichli ba'alma. It's really only a dichlu ba'alma to say this svara that it's because of woman. Talking that arrive from there, would be called Mokayim Divi Ravina Emesain that with the average she's going to be mutter. Okay. But I just learned that feel of him maskana ain lesser yichud muat. There's a difference between yichud for a minute and a woman who's captured and is by her captors for an extended period of time. The dafka nech b'shashani. Maybe dafka the case where she's asur labaila is if she was captured. Levishi misur b'yadai, because she's totally under the control of her captor. Ken behema, not much different than a behema. The hacha, the b'yadai l'rava, just like a goy who has control over your animal, kibir avayit. So too, if he has control over a woman because he's captured her, and then he will violate her. Kalal, she's biyachid with a man, but she's not under his control at all. To the contrary, if he tries to start up with her, she'll scream, and someone will come save her. So therefore, we're not concerned. Therefore, the Chacham would be scared, and he will not violate her. And therefore, there's no reason to ask her because of that yichud. And that's pshat. Okay, so now we understand the differences. Now Rashi learns that this is a Eishes Yisrael. If this is an Eishes Yisrael that we're talking about, then why would she ever be Aser for Ektoisus? Why would she ever be Aser? Because a Eishes Yisrael that was Nensa is Mutter L'Baila. Elamai, there's got to be a chashash over here that she did it baratzon. Maybe she did it baratzon once she's there under the control of her captor. Maybe she was mezana baratzon. That must be the shaila, and that's why even though she's an Eishes Yisrael, she's going to be aser. Let's see Rashi inside. The chashinon zok Rashi shema nivel la'echad mehen baratzon. That she was nivel la'echad baratzon. That's the problem. Now there's a very interesting shaila. Rashi will learn is literally baratzon. She got corrupted in some way, and now she's being developed baratzon. So there's a scenario. There's a horrible, horrible story that the Noid of Yehuda talks about, and other early Rishonim that's happened in the 1700s, where a group of people were traveling, men and women, were traveling, fine from Erlich people, and they stayed over at a motel overnight that was on the edge of the forest, and a group of gangsters came and was going to kill them all. And one of the women there decided to save the group and to sacrifice herself, and she seduced the head robber, and in fact, she succeeded in saving everybody. So there's a three-way machlokes in the early achronim. If she did an affair, maybe she had no right to do that. You find that Esther did it and that Yael did it. Well, they're saving the rabbin, they're saving all of Klal Yisrael. Who said for a private issue she's allowed to do that? But other achronim said, it's a mitzvah what she did. She sacrificed herself to save Eden. That's a huge mitzvah. The shaila was, will she be Asr L'Baila? So there's those achronim who say she did a wonderful mitzvah, but she's still Asur L'Baila. Just like Esther said, Chasher Avadati Avadati. She's Asr L'Baila. But there was also a shita who held that she's Mutter L'Baila. Because this is an interesting case. The Bia was Baratzai. but the scenario was b'oinus. She doesn't really want to be with this man. She did it b'rotzen to save him. So is that called oinus? So there are one of the achronim in the Shubas form says that's called oinus, even though she willingly was novellas, but the circumstances were such that she was forced, she was coerced because of the circumstances. That's considered an oinus, and she's mutal baila, and they bring a raya because there are those who want to bring a raya. You see, Yal Eishes Chever Akeni, she killed Sisera, she became Asher Baila. But there are those who say Adarabah, she didn't become Asher Baila. Because even in the Shira, we say, Yal Eishes Hakeni, I think.
Isn't Kani that, is she Jewish? Kani is really from Yisra, isn't it?
She must have been Jewish because they're bringing a riot from her. But the fact is that she's still called Eishes, even after she did it, would be a riot that she's Muteres L'Baila. Because if she was Asher L'Baila, they wouldn't refer to her as Eishes anymore after this incident happened, because she would have become Asher L'Baila. So that's one of the Achronim bring a riot, in fact, that this would be Muter L'Baila even. Okay, Baltic. It was a fascinating story. It's a tragic story, but it's a fascinating story.
What does it mean, Kani, then? What does Kani mean?
Maybe he lived by the Kani, but he must have been Jewish, otherwise the whole Shiloh wouldn't be relevant.
No, they didn't have to add that she was a Kani, so that must have some meaning.
I don't know. I wish I knew my Navi. Then I have meaning for it.
Me too. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see the Gemara weiter. Rav Padas Omar Loy Kasha. Rav Padas has another way to answer the Kasha. What was the Kasha again? Our Mishnah says you're not allowed to give a behemoth to a goy, and the other Mishnah we quoted says you're allowed to buy a behemoth from a goy for a korban. Rav Padas Omar Loy Kasha. Harab Eliezer, Harab Omen. There's actually a machlokes if you're allowed to buy a behemoth from a goy, if you're choshid for Reviyah. The Tanan we learned in a Mishnah. Gabi Poras Chatos, by a Par Aduma. You're not allowed to buy a Par Aduma from a goy. So everyone's going to jump and ask, what about Dama ben Yasina, the famous story? The Gemara is going to bring that story shortly, how they bought it from him. But Rabbi Lezer holds you're not allowed to buy a Par Aduma from a goy. You are allowed to buy it from a goy. So why is there a machlokes about whether or not you're allowed to buy a Par Aduma from a goy? What's the machlokes? My love, vakamivically. Let's say that's the machlokes. Rabbi Lezer over chashina on the Reviyah, like our Mishnah. Rabbi Lezer over like chashina on the Reviyah, like the brisa that allows you to buy an animal from a goy for a korban. Fact tomorrow, who said that that's what they're arguing about? Mimai. Dilma the chula amal loy chashina the Reviyah. Maybe Sai Rabbi Eliezer and Sai the Rabbanon are not choshish the Reviyah. They disagree with our Mishnah. V'hacha hainu taima the Rabbi Eliezer. You know why Rabbi Eliezer holds that you're not allowed to buy an animal from a goy to serve as a paraduma? Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Rabbi Eliezer holds like the halacha that Rabbi Yehuda learned from his Rabbi Rav. Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Hiniach alein oida shel sakin posla. What happens if you left some bundle of bags on the animal? Not really a heavy load. A nar shazach. It puzzles it because it says about a paraduma asher lo yaleh oil. It couldn't have had anything on it, and you put the small bag of whatever it was, it will puzzle the animal. But egla, if it's an egla rufa, there the Torah doesn't say asher Allah oil. It says that you were moishechet. You'd have to pull the animal with it because it says asher moshcha oil. But maybe the case was nothing to do with Reviyah. But the question is, are we choshid that the goy might have used the animal for some slight malach? Mar savar chashinon. Rabbi Eliezer holds we're choshish that the owner used the animal in some way, and now it's possible to be a par aduma. That's why you cannot buy it from a goy. The Rabban and the Mar savar lo chashin. It's not mistaber to say that that's the machlokes of Eliezer and the Chachamim, because nobody would even have a hamamina to think that a goy would do any malacha with the paraduma. Too valuable. Mishum nicha purta loy mafsatuva. No way, just to have a little convenience of putting some light object down on the animal, would the goy risk and jeopardize the high value of this animal. So talk to the Gemara. So for the same reason, you shouldn't be choshesh l'revia. Hachanami leimim mishamana porto leimachted tuva. The Gemara is a very big difference. Halsam yutzrei toitfloi. When a goy has a taiva for his nus for being revered animal, he won't pay. The fact that it costs money won't stop him. We have many bad habits that cost a lot of money, yet we do them anyway. When it comes to Yetzer Hara, money won't hold him back. And therefore, there's still a place to say that he's choshet for Revia, and therefore, maybe that's the machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, if you're choshet l'Revia. Frank the Gemara, who said that's the machlokes? But Dilma Kula Alma Loy Chashin l'Revia. Maybe nobody's choshet l'Revia, nobody holds like a Mishnah, they hold like the Brisa that you can buy an animal from them for a carbon. Maybe the reason why Rabbi Elazar holds you not allowed to buy a paraduma from a goy is because of a separate xeris cost. Okay, the Tani Shila, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. What is this for Rabbi Eliezer that you're not allowed to buy a paraduma from a goy? Because it says in the pasuk, Daber al bnei Yisrael the yikhu elecha. Well, the yikhu elecha means you should buy from the person who owns the paraduma. But we dashin, Rashi says, yikhu is a lashon yimkru kribe v'yakichu. Yakichu means to cause a sale by being the moicher. So Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yikchu elecha, and the bnei Yisrael should sell to you. Bnei Yisrael yichu, bnei Yisrael could sell to the Beis Hamikdash, the paraduma, ve'eino oivdei chavim yichu. So that's what the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan is as to whether or not you could buy a paraduma from a goy. It's not mistaber to say that this is the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Why? The Katani Seifa, the Seifa this Brisa says, "V'chein haya Rabbi Eliezer poshel v'chol hakarbanos kulam." Rabbi Eliezer holds the same way you cannot buy a carbon, can't buy a paraduma from a goy, you can't buy any carbon from a goy. V'yisal gadaitach kidetani shila. If you're going to say the reason is because of shilas zersa kosim, that applies only to paraduma, bishlam a par ksiv b'kicha, and l'kulu karbanos kicha ksiv b'hu. It doesn't say kicha, and therefore it doesn't make sense to say that the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan is about if you're allowed to buy it paraduma from a goy. So we're back to square one. It must be that they're arguing about if chashin and l'revia. Correct the Gemara. You don't have a raya. No, period. So that takes care of that. So therefore, Pashas we have a raya. That the machlokes between Eliezer and Rabbanan is whether or not you're choshesh l'revia. Period. Now the Gemara Tanukah. The Dilma atkan like pligi Rabbanan led Rabbi Eliezer. Maybe where do the Rabbanan argue on Rabbi Eliezer? And they say that it's mutter to buy a paraduma from a goy, and you're not choshesh l'revia. Maybe that is only turning on to Chav Gimel Amud Beis. Maybe that is only Ella Bipara. You know why? Did they make Yikarit? You know where the Rabbanan say you could buy a paraduma from a goy, and you were not worried that he's reveyed? That's by a paraduma. It's worth so much money. It could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. He's not going to jeopardize it by being reveyed. Aval b'shar karbanos, but maybe the other karbanos where the amount of money that he could sell the animal for is not that much. And maybe even the Rabbanan would be moida that you wouldn't be able to buy a carbon from a goy. So once again, you cannot tell me that the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan if you're choshesh for revia, and the machlokes would even be by a carbon because mehechadesi. The Rabbanan only said their halacha that it's mutter by a paraduma. A paraduma, we can justify why it's mutter. The guy's not going to destroy a very valuable asset. But a regular carbon that he's selling an animal for, maybe he was revealed. So ve'ela, hadatanya, it says in the Brisa, loichin mehen behema lekarbon. You're allowed to buy a behema from a goy for a carbon. Now, the way you just wanted to learn now, that even the Rabbanan are moida, you cannot buy a carbon from a goy, you can only buy a paraduma. Who is going to be the author of this brisa? Loichin mehen behema lekarbon. Mali. Lo Rabbi Eliezer. He holds you can't even buy a paraduma because you're choshesh l'revia. Lo Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan only argue by paraduma because it's expensive. I have another kasha on your sheet. Tanya Be'edu, we learned a Raisa. My usivi lay chavoy le Rebbe Lozer. How did the Rabbanon argue in Rebbe Lozer? Rebbe Lozer said it's also to buy a paraduma from a goy. How did the Rabbanon refute that? Where did they bring a raya that in fact you are allowed to buy a paraduma from a goy? Because they quoted a pasuk. It says, "Called sign kader." All of the sheep that came from Yishmael. So these are animals that you're buying from a goy. Yikvitzulach yalu. We have to look at the inside the pasuk because this is not how the pasuk reads. Let's look over here. Yalu al rotzain mizbechi. Now al rotzain doesn't mean it's yalu l'rotzain. But Rashi says it's sort of like a drasha. Yalu al rotzain mizbechi. We learn from there that animals that you would take from Yishmael would be able to be brought on the mizbeach. So if that's what the Rabbanon told Rebbe Lozer, clearly they're not talking about exclusively paraduma. Yalo Rotzal al Mizbechi is referring to all karbanis. So you see that the Rabbanon shita is by all karbanis. You're allowed to buy it from a goy, and therefore, Pashas the machlokes between the Belez and the Rabbanon is by all karbanis. Are you choshid the animal that you bought from a goy that it was nirva? Because if it was a reva nirva, then it wouldn't be good for a carbon, like Rabbi Eliezer says. Shita of the Chachamim is that we're not choshid. Zok to Gemara. Akan like pligi el b'chashash. The discussion that we've had until now, whether or not you're allowed to buy a behemoth or a carbon from a goy, is if you're choshid. We don't know for sure that the goy was boiled. We're choshid that the goy was reveya. But what would be the case of hecha devadei? What if we know for sure the goy violated the animal? Pasla. Everybody would agree that the paraduma will be possible. The paraduma is for sure possible if we know for sure that it was nirva. The problem is, shemamina the para kachim is be'achi. It must be that para is kachim is be'ach. It must be considered like a carbon. The kachim bedek kabayis mi mifsala bar revia. Bedek kabayis doesn't become possible with revia. If an animal is nirva, it's possible to be brought on the mizbeach, but it can still be donated to bedek kabayis. And if the paraduma does not have a status of a carbon, it just has a status of bedek kabayis. Why should you not be able to buy a paraduma from a goy? Why should there ever be a problem? Zok to Gemara, shiny para, the chat is koyerachma. Yes, paraduma might be bedek kabayis, but the Torah refers to it as a chatos, and therefore we give it certain characteristics of a carbon, such as that a nirva would be possible. If you're going to tell me that we treat a paraduma like a chatos, well, guess what? A chatos that was born through C-section, is possible to be brought as a chatos. So, it should be possible to use a C-section born paraduma either as well. And if you can say, yeah, who said that's wrong? Maybe if the paraduma was born C-section, it's not a good paraduma. You can't say that because Allah Matanya Hikdisha b'yoytedayfen psula. If you were makdish a paraduma as a yoytedayfen, it's possible. That's good. But the problem is Reb Shimon Machshir. How could Reb Shimon be Machshir? If it has the din of a carbon? If we compare a paraduma to a chatos, and by a chatos, a yoytedayfen would be usher. How could Reb Shimon be Machshir here with a yoytedayfen? And if you're going to say Reb Shimon knows that a yoytedayfen is not possible. He disagrees with the whole thing. A C-section is not possible, not for a chatos, not for a paraduma, not for any carbon. Where do you see yes at the shita? The Amar yoytedayfen Vlad Ma'al. Where did he say that? We know that there's a very big difference between a child that was born with a vaginal birth versus a C-section. One nafkamina, which I just had with my ankle, is that if the baby is born through C-section, the Yom HaShmini Yimol B'Sar Losoi does not apply, and therefore the bris on the 8th day will not be Doicha Shabbos for a C-section baby. Or Lagabi Yerusha, Lagabi firstborn for Yerusha, there's many different shilas about what the halacha by yoytedayfen is. But Reb Shimon holds that the yoytedayfen Vlad Ma'al. Reb Shimon holds it's Vlad Ma'al. Or the other place where it's negated is, are there Yemei Tumah, Yemei Taira? Normally after a woman gives birth, if it's a boy, there's 7 days if you made tumah, and there's 33 days if you made taira. If it's a girl, there's 14 days if you made tumah, and 66 days of you made taira. So that only applies according to the Chametz if it's a vaginal birth. But Shimon holds no, even a Yosy Doifin is a Vlad Malya. So if you're going to say we're going according to Shimon, who holds that by Tumah and Tahira, Yosy Doifin is a Vlad Malya, and that's why he holds that you're allowed to bring it for the Par Aduma, but that's not true. Because the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Moida Haya Rab Shimon was Moida Linya Kochim Shein Kodesh. This halacha that Rab Shimon said that a C-section animal or a C-section human triggers the Yemei Tumah and the Yemei Taira as a regular human, that only applies to that halacha. But Lagabe, whether or not you're allowed to bring it as a carbon, Rabbi Yochanan tells us that Rab Shimon agrees that you can't bring it as a carbon. So, weiter, if it's Chatas Karya Rachmana, how could we explain why Rab Shimon holds that Yosy Doifin is Ksher? Ella shiny para, really a para is a better kabayis. It's not a carbon. But a chaylu mum poiselba, dvar erva, v'avodah nami poiselba. We know there's a Xeris HaKosev that says that the Paraduma may not have a mum. Not because it's considered a carbon, not because it's considered a chatas, but we know the Torah says it's not allowed to have a mum. So let's say the same way a mum passes it, so too dvar erva and avodah paisel, because that's it's ki mashchosam bahem mumbai, and that means there's a hashchosa there, which always refers to avodah and arayis. So it says in the pasuk, "Haylu mum paisel ba dvar erva avodah nami paisel dechsev ki mashchosam bahem mumbam." So the mum is referred to as hashchosa. So therefore, znus revia as well as avodah is also hashchosa. Tantre b'shmol kol mokum shnema hashchosa. Whenever it says hashchosa, ena yelud dvar erva v'avodah zarah. It refers to the two averos of erva and avodah zarah. Dvar erva dechsev ki hishchis kol basar is darka al. So that you see where by the Mabel the hashchosa was nus, and he uses the word hashchosa. By avodah zarah dechsev pent hashchisun v'asisem lachem pesach. So you see both avodah zarah and znus is referred to as a hashchosa, and therefore the same way a mum disqualifies a paraduma, so too will hashchosa, which is reveya and avodah zarah, passel an animal from being a part. Gufa zaktamar. Tani Shila. Shila said, "My time of Rabbi Eliezer. Why does Rabbi Eliezer say that you cannot buy a paraduma from a goy? Nechsev daber el bnei Yisrael v'yikchu. Bnei Yisrael yikchu ve'ein ha'oived chav yikchu." So zaktamar el mayata. If you're going to tell me whenever it says yikchu, it means you can only buy it from a Yisrael. Well, let's look at the first time the Torah asks people to donate money to the Mishkan. It says, "Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yichuli truma." Hachanami, you're going to tell me the bnei Yisrael yichu ve'ein ha'oived chav yikchu? Are you going to tell me that no goy was allowed to contribute anything of value to the Mishkan? And if you're going to say yes, maybe in fact a goy may not contribute. We will not accept donations towards the Mishkan and the base of Mikdash from a goy, but it's not true. Because the Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, in this case, Rabbi Yehuda was quoting from his Rebbe Shmuel. Sha'alos Rabbi Lozer, that's Rabbi Lozer. Ateichen kibbut aveim. How far does the mitzvah of kibbut aveim go? Amar Lemi told him, Tzu uru ma asa oivit kechavim echad lo ovid ba'ashkol. Let's show you what a goy's hasagas of kibbut aveim in Ashkelon. Who was this goy and what was the story? Aduma ben Nesina Shemai, one of the most famous goyim. Hamachas bikshu mimenu avadim la'ephod. They wanted it, but he had avadim that would have been appropriate for the ephod. Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos literally means the ephod, or if it means the choshen, which is connected to the ephod. Now he could have made a fortune of money had he sold this to the base of Mikdash. B'shisha mibo ischar, he would have made 60 times 10,000, $600,000 of profit. He would have made. That's a huge amount of money. And Reb Chana Masli b'shmoinim riboy. It was $800,000. But the problem was the keys were under his father's head, and he wouldn't be able to get the keys to unlock the vault to give him the diamond but to give him this avonim, unless he would wake up his father. Well, Lloyd Tzierah, and he was not Mitzayir his father, to wake him up and so you see what a madrega of kibbut avi had. Now, if that was my son, are you crazy? We could have made this money and you gave up on it. But I guess he knew that the father wasn't interested. Avnei Zok Gemara, that's not a right. Because Avnei Shayim Hifsek. There's no vav in front of Avnei Shayim. It says Avnei Shayim Avnei Meluim. So the Avnei Shayim, there's no vav connecting it to the V'yichli Truma. So V'yichli Truma might go on the Zav Chesav and the Choshes, but it doesn't go on the Avnei Shayim. Correct Gemara. V'hav Avnei Meluim Ksiv. After it says Avnei Shayim, it says Avnei Shayim V'avnei Meluim. So the vav of Avnei Meluim will connect everything back to the V'yichlu. V'avnei Meluim Ksiv the other Arvei. Zot Gemara V'oid Katoni Seifa. The Seifa says Lashon Acheres as a schar for this fellow. The next year, Nolda like Para Aduma Be'edrei. He was zoicha that in his flock a Para Aduma was born. Nichnasu Chachma Yisrael Etzlei. So they went to buy from him. This would have been way more than $600,000. Amalam, he said, Yodei ani b'chem, I know you. Shemani mevakesh mikem kol mammon shaboilim. No matter what price I would dictate, you would give it. All I want is Anted Moshe. Achshav eini mevakesh mikem elo oisei mammon shefsadati b'shvil abba. I just want the money that I lost because of the cover that has my father. I want my $600,000. But what do you see from here clearly is they bought the paraduma from him. So the problem is, how could they buy a paraduma from a goy field that's usher? And if the svar is from the Yichuli, so I'm sorry, the stone that they bought from him, no, I'm sorry, it's also a problem. Even the stone, it says the Yichuli, which means the key has to be from the Yisrael. So how could they have bought the stone from the guy? And how could they have bought the paraduma from the guy? Zok to Gemara, Hosam Ayidei Tagre Yisrael Zok. The guy didn't sell directly to the Beis Hamikdash. They made sure that there would be a middleman, a Jewish middleman who can make money on the spread. But the main thing is the purchase was not made directly from the guy. The purchase was done through a broker. So the broker bought it from the guy, and then the broker resold it to the Beis Hamikdash.
Well, what's the difference? The idea is that it once belonged to a guy, and therefore it's choshed for a riot.
No, it's not choshed Revi. This is because of a yichli. It's exeris hakosov. This the last word we just said was some Sheila explained to Rabbi Eliezer that has nothing to do with Revia. It's only because of a pasuk of a yichli. It has to be bought. The transaction that transfers it into hektish has to be bought from a yid. But where that yid sourced it from, the Gemara is telling here, won't make a difference. If you're chosh l'reviyah, it's a whole different shayla. But Sheila is learning the machlokes that has nothing to do with reviyah. You're not chosh for reviyah. It's a whole new machlokes. If there's exeris hakosov that you have to buy this from a yid. I was telling someone last night, Jews were always brokers. Here they had to be a broker because you couldn't buy. But the way the Jews got into banking was because goyim wanted to lend for interest, and they're not allowed to lend for interest to another goy. So they always had to do it through a Jew, because they're allowed to charge interest to a Jew, and the Jews are allowed to charge them interest. So they forced the Jews into being bankers. So the joke is they're always saying the Jews are taking over the world, they control the banks. You forced us to control the banks. And then when the goyim would kill the Yidden because they owed him so much money, the real loser wasn't the Jew. He maybe made 2 points on the spread. The 20% loan shark interest was really going to the pirates, who was just using the Jew as a patsy. Now, I find it that in Iran, any person who the Ayatollah owes a lot of money to, he promotes him as a general. Okay, Kvaldik.
Okay.
Have an awesome day.
Shkaya.